Okay, hello. We are back with more Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, and the annoying bright-ass sun. Blinded by the sun. No. Normally I don't have the camera facing that way, and pardon the background noise. Obviously I'm not in my quiet cave, but I am working on a sewing project, so I kind of need the desk space. Let's see if I can fix the camera up. Just, I'll at least move my laptop just a bit. Okay. Okay. A little better. A little better. Okay. So we left off at chapter 8 with Elizabeth and Jane, if I remember her first name. Yes, Elizabeth and Jane staying with the Bingleys because Jane got a little sick, and the two youngest of the sisters are off wooing or being wooed by the local soldiers. And if I remember my Pride and Prejudice, one of them is going to do something stupid with those soldiers. I don't remember which one, but I know what happens. I'm very sorry about the sunlight. There's nothing I can do. I live in Florida. Kind of got an abundance of that. If I could give that sunlight to other people, I would. Just take it. Take it. We don't need it here. Chapter 8. At 5 o'clock, Elizabeth Wow, Odie's off to a good start. At 5 o'clock, Elizabeth retired to meditate and dress, and at 6:30, she was summoned to dinner. Jane was by no means better. The sisters, on hearing this, repeated 3 or 4 times how much they were grieved, how shocking it was to have a bad cold, and how excessively they disliked being ill themselves. And then thought no more of the matter. Their indifference towards Jane was, when not immediately before them, restored Elizabeth to her former dislike. Their brother, Mr. Bingley, was the only one of the party whom she could regard with any complacency. His anxiety for Jane was evident, and his attentions to herself were most pleasing, and they prevented her feeling herself so much an intruder as she believed she was considered by the others. When dinner was over, Elizabeth returned directly to Jane, and Miss Bingley began abusing her as soon as she was out of the room. Her manners were pronounced to be very bad indeed, a mixture of pride and impertinence, and she had no conversation, no style, no beauty. Mrs. Hurst thought the same and added, "She has nothing, in short, to recommend her but being well schooled in the ways of combat. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild." "She did indeed, Louisa. Why must she be scampering about the country in such dangerous times because her sister has a cold? Her hair is so untidy, so blousy." "Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat, 6 inches deep in mud. I am absolutely certain, and pieces of undead flesh upon her sleeve, no doubt from her attackers." "Your picture may be very exact, Louisa," said Bingley, "but this was all lost upon me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice." "You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I am sure," said Miss Bingley, "and I am inclined to think that you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition." "Certainly not. To walk 3 miles, or whatever it is, above her ankles in dirt, and quite alone, with the unmentionable menace dragging poor souls off the road and to their doom day and night. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceit, independence. It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country town indifference to decorum." "It shows an affection for her sister that is very pleasing," said Bingley. "I am afraid, Mr. Darcy," observed Miss Bingley in a half-whisper, "that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes." "Not at all," he replied. "They were brightened by the exercise." A short pause followed this speech, and Mrs. Hurst began again. "I have an excessive regard for Miss Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart that she were well settled. But with such a father and a mother, and such low connections, I'm afraid there is no chance of it." I think I have heard you say that their uncle is an attorney on Merton. "Yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside." "That is capital," added her sister, and they both laughed heartily. "If they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside," cried Bingley, "it would not make them one jot less agreeable. Have you no regard for them as warriors? Indeed, I have never seen ladies so steady-handed in combat. But it must very materially lessen their chances of marrying men of any consideration in the world," replied Darcy. To this speech Bingley made no answer, but his sisters gave their hearty assent. With a renewal of tenderness, however, they returned to Jane's room on leaving the dining parlour, and sat with her till summoned to coffee. She was still very poorly, and Elizabeth would not quit her at all, till late in the evening, when she had the comfort of seeing her asleep, and when it seemed to her rather right than pleasant that she should go downstairs herself. On entering the drawing-room, she found the whole party at cards, and was immediately invited to join them, but suspecting them to be playing high, she declined it, and making her sister the excuse, said that she would amuse herself for the short time she could stay below with a book. Mr. Hurst looked at her with astonishment. "Do you prefer reading to cards?" said he. "That is rather singular." "I prefer a great many things to cards, Mr. Hurst," said Elizabeth, "not the least of which is the sensation of a newly sharpened blade as it punctures the round belly of a man." Mr. Hurst was silent for the remainder of the evening. "In nursing your sister, I am sure you have pleasure," said Bingley, "and I hope it will be soon increased by seeing her quite well." Elizabeth thanked him, and then walked towards the table where a few books were lying. He immediately offered to fetch her others, all that his library afforded. I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit. But I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever looked into." Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. "I am astonished," said Miss Bingley, "that my father should have left so little a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy." "It ought to be good," he replied. "It has been the work of many generations." "And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books." "I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. What have we to do but stay indoors and read till the cure is at last discovered?" Elizabeth turned her attention away from her book and drew near the card table, and stationed herself between Mr. Bingley and his eldest sister to observe the game. "Is Miss Darcy much grown since the spring?" said Miss Bingley. "Will she be as tall as I am?" "I think she will. She is now about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or rather taller." "How I long to see her again! I never met with anyone who delighted me so much. Such a countenance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age." "It is amazing to me," said Bingley, "how young ladies can have patience to be so very accomplished as they are." "All young ladies accomplished? My dear Charles, what do you mean?" "They all paint tables, cover screens, and net purses. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I'm sure I've never heard a young lady spoken of for the first time without being informed that she is very accomplished." "The word is applied," said Darcy, "to many a woman who deserves it no otherwise than by netting a purse and covering a screen. My sister Georgina deserves the distinction, however, for she is not only master of the female arts, but the deadly as well. I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen in the whole range of my acquaintance that are thus accomplished." "Nor I am sure. "Nor I am sure," said Miss Bingley. "Then, Mr. Darcy," observed Elizabeth, "you must comprehend a great deal in your idea of an accomplished woman. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages. She must be well trained in the fighting styles of the Kyoto masters and the modern tactics and weaponry of Europe. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. All this she must possess, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensively reading." Okay, there's something I want to double check that kind of confused me last episode. So they mentioned katanas in the last episode, and now they're mentioning Kyoto. So I'm kind of curious, and I'm very bad at putting two and two together. But let's see, when does Pride and Prejudice take place? Okay, so this is the early 19th century, turn of the 19th century. It is in the, I was right, Regency period of British history. So between 1797 and 1815. Okay. Oh, When did Japan reopen no, hold on. When did the black ships enter Japan? Oh, let's see. 1853. Okay. Okay. So, I was right. At least I thought so. Japan was still technically closed to outsiders during the period that this book is supposed to be taking place. So the mention of katanas and Kyoto and Japanese style martial arts isn't really supposed to exist. But you know what? It's one, a fantasy book because, well, fiction, and two, it's got zombies. So honestly, who cares? I just want to be a little history, put a little history in there because I do love my history. So yes, the fact that they mentioned Japan or anything that has to do with Japan is really could not have happened because it was still technically closed to outsiders, with maybe the exception of the Dutch. But that's the Dutch. This is England, so. But again, it's a fiction book. It's got zombies. Yeah. It would make more sense if they mentioned more Chinese style fighting. But again, they opted for Japan because it's Japan. I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at you knowing any. Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? I never saw such a woman. In my experience, a woman is either highly trained or highly refined. One cannot afford the luxury of both in such times. As for my sisters and I, our dear father thought it best that we give less of our times to books and music, and more to protecting ourselves from the sorry-stricken. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of her implied doubt, and both were protesting that they knew many women who answered this description when Mr. Hurst called them to order. All conversation was thereby at an end. Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room. Elizabeth Bennet, said Miss Bingley when the door was closed on her, is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own. And with many men, I dare say, it succeeds. But in my opinion, it is a paltry device, a very mean art. Undoubtedly, replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed. There is a meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever bears affinity to cunning is despicable. Miss Bingley was not so entirely satisfied with this reply as to continue the subject. Elizabeth joined them again, only to say that her sister is worse, and that she could not leave her. Bingley urged Mr. Jones being sent for immediately, while his sisters, convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended an express to town for one of the most eminent physicians. This she would not hear of. It was too dangerous to dispatch a rider at night. But she was willing to comply with their brother's proposal, and it was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning if Miss Bennet were not decidedly better. Bingley was quite uncomfortable. His sisters declared that they were miserable. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, which he could find no better relief to his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every attention might be paid to the sick lady and her sister. Chapter 9. Elizabeth passed the chief of the night. Let me just get myself a little more comfortable. If I'm going to be sitting up, I need to at least have... And then I can bring this closer. Not that it really makes much of a difference. It's a pretty decent... I like this microphone. It's a pretty decent one. Elizabeth passed the chief of the night in her sister's room, and in the morning had the pleasure of being able to send a tolerable answer to the inquiries which she was early received from Mr. Bingley by a housemaid. She requested to have a note sent to Longbourn, desiring her mother to visit Jane, and form her own judgment of her situation. The note was immediately dispatched, but the writer was met with a group of freshly unearthed zombies on the road and dragged off to his presumable demise. The note was dispatched a second time with more success, and its contents as quickly complied with. Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her two youngest and their longbows, reached Netherfield soon after the family breakfast. Oh, this time they have bows. Swords, muskets, daggers, bows. Had she found Jane in any apparent danger of having the strange plague, Mrs. Bennet would have been very miserable. But being satisfied on seeing that her illness was not alarming, she had no wish of her recovering immediately. As to her restoration to health, would probably remove her from Netherfield. She would not listen, therefore, to her daughter's proposal of being carried home. Neither did the apothecary, who arrived about the same time, think it at all advisable. Bingley met them with hopes that Mrs. Bennet had not found Miss Bennet worse than she had expected. "Indeed I have, sir," was her answer. "She is a great deal too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we must not think of moving her. We must trespass a little longer on your kindness." "Removed!" cried Bingley. "It must not be thought of." Mrs. Bennet was profuse in her acknowledgments. "I am sure," she added, "if it was not for such good friends, I do not know what would become of her, for she is very ill indeed, and suffers a vast deal, though with great patience in the world, no doubt, due to her many months under the tutelage of Master Liu." "Might I expect to meet this gentleman here in Hertfordshire?" asked Bingley. "I rather think you shan't," she replied, "for he has never left the confines of the Shaolin Temple in Henan province. It was there that our girls spent many a long day being trained to endure all manners of discomfort." "May I inquire as to the nature of this discomfort?" "You may inquire," said Elizabeth, "though I would much prefer to give you a demonstration." "Lizzie!" cried her mother, Remember where you are, and do not run on in the wild manner that you are suffered to do so at home. I hardly know you to possess such character, said Bingley. My own character is of little consequence, replied Elizabeth. It is the character of others which concerns me. I devote a great many hours to the study of it. The country, said Darcy, can in general supply but a few subjects for such a study. In a country neighborhood, you move in a very confined and unsavory society. Excepting, of course, when the country is overrun with the same unmentionables as town. Yes, indeed, cried Mrs. Bennet, offended by her manner of mentioning a country neighborhood. Oh, offended by his manner of mentioning a country neighborhood. I assure you that there is quite as much of that going on in the country as in town. Everyone was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at her for a moment, turned silently away. Mrs. Bennet, who fancied she had gained a complete victory over him, continues her triumph. I cannot see that London has any great advantage over the country, particularly since the walls were built. It may be a fortress replete with shops, but it is a fortress nonetheless, and hardly fit for the fragile nerves of a gentle lady. The country is a vast deal pleasanter, is it not, Mr. Bingley? When I am in the country, he replied, I never wish to leave it, and when I am in town, it is pretty much the same. They have each their advantages, both in regards to the plague and otherwise. For while I sleep more soundly in the safety of town, I find my general disposition much improved by my present surroundings. Aye, that is because you have the right disposition. But that gentleman, looking at Darcy, seems to think the country was nothing at all. Indeed, mamma, you are mistaken, said Elizabeth, blushing for her mother. You quite mistook Mr. Darcy. He only meant that there was not such a variety of people to be met with in the country as in the town, which you must acknowledge to be true. Just as Mr. Darcy would surely acknowledge that the scarcity of graveyards makes the country altogether more agreeable in times such as these. Certainly, my dear, but as to not meeting with many people in this neighborhood, I believe that there are few neighborhoods larger. I know we dine with 24 families. 23, I suppose. God rest poor Mrs. Long's soul. Darcy only smiled, and the general pause which ensued made Elizabeth tremble. She longed to speak, but could think of nothing to say, and after a short silence, Mrs. Bennet began repeating her thanks to Mr. Bingley for his kindness to Jane, with an apology for troubling him also with Lizzie. Mr. Bingley was unaffectedly civil in his answer, and forced his younger sister to be civil also, and say what the occasion required. She performed her part without much graciousness, but Mrs. Bennet was satisfied, and soon afterwards ordered her carriage. Upon this signal, the youngest of her daughters put herself forward. The two girls had been whispering to each other during the whole visit, and the result of it was that the youngest should tax Mr. Bingley with having promised on his first coming to the countryside to give a ball at Netherfield. Lydia was a stout, well-grown girl of 15, with a fine complexion and good-humored countenance. She had every bit of Lizzie's deadly nature, though little of her sense, and had vanquished her first unmentionable at the remarkable age of 7½ years. She was very equal, therefore, to address Mr. Bingley on the subject of the ball, and abruptly reminded him of his promise, adding that it would be the most shameful thing in the world if he did not keep it. His answer to this sudden attack was delightful to their mother's ear. "I am perfectly ready, I assure you, to keep my engagement, and when your sister is recovered, you shall, if you please, name the very day of the ball. But you would not wish to be dancing when she is ill." Lydia declared herself satisfied. "Oh, yes, it would be much better to wait till Jane was well, and by that time most likely Captain Carter would also be at Meryton again. And when you have given your ball," she added, "I shall insist on their giving one also. I shall tell Colonel Forster it would be quite a shame if he does not." Mrs. Bennet and her daughters then departed, and Elizabeth returned instantly to Jane, leaving her own and her relations' behaviour to the remarks of the two ladies and Mr. Darcy, the latter of whom, however, could not be prevailed to join in their censure of her, in spite of all Mrs. Bingley's witticism on fine eyes. The day passed as much as the day before had done. Mrs. Hurt and Miss Bingley had spent some hours of the morning with the invalid, who continued, though slowly, to mend, and in the evening Elizabeth joined their party in the drawing-room. The card table, however, did not appear. Mr. Darcy was writing, and Miss Bingley, seated near him, was watching the progress of his letter, and repeatedly calling off his attention by messages to his sister. Mr. Hurt and Mr. Bingley were at Piquet, 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 and Mrs. Hurst was observing their game. What is that? Piquet. Game. Okay, it is a French card game. That would explain the fact that I cannot say the name. Okay, yeah, it's a French card game. Elizabeth took up the oiling of her musket stock, and was significantly amused in attending to what passed between Darcy and his companion. "How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter!" He made no answer. "You write uncommonly fast." "And you prattle uncommonly much." "How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of a year! Letters of business, too! How odious I should think of them! And how odious indeed that I should so often suffer to write them in your company. Pray tell your sister that I long to see her." "I have already told her so once, by your desire." "How can you contrive to write so even?" He was silent. "Tell your sister I am delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp, and pray let her know that I am quite in raptures with her beautiful little design for a table." Miss Bingley the groans of 100 unmentionables would be more pleasing to my ears than one more word from your mouth. Were you not otherwise agreeable, I should be forced to remove your tongue with my sabre. Oh, if it is of no consequence, I shall see her in January. But do you always write such charming long letters to her, Mr. Darcy? They are generally long, but whether always charming it is not for me to determine. It is a rule with me that a person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill. Yeah, Miss Bingley, you have yet to meet me. I ramble. Very much so. So, yeah, if I start writing a letter, or anything for that matter, it just devolves into a incoherent jumble of word vomit. Oh, it's a good thing I don't exist in this time period. That will not do for compliment to Darcy, Caroline, cried her brother, because he does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of four syllables. Do you not, Darcy? Mr. Darcy continued to work on his letter in silence, though Elizabeth perceived him to be a great deal annoyed with his friends. When that business was over, Mr. Darcy applied to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth for an indulgence of some music. Miss Bingley moved with some alacrity to the pianoforte, and after a polite request that Elizabeth would lead the way, she seated herself. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister as Elizabeth played. When once the earth was still and dead was silent, and London town was for but living men, come the plague upon us swift and violent, and so our dearest England we defend. While they were thus employed, Elizabeth could not help observing how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. She hardly knew how to suppose that she could be an object of admiration to so great a man, and yet that he should look at her because he disliked her was still more strange. She could only imagine, however, that she drew his notice because there was something more wrong and reprehensible, according to his idea of right, than in any other person present. The supposition did not pain her. She liked him too little to care for his approbation. Miss Bingley played next, varying the charm by a lively Scotch air, and soon afterward Mr. Darcy, drawing near Elizabeth, said to her, "Do you not feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to seize such an opportunity of dancing a reel?" She smiled, but made no answer. He repeated the question, with some surprise at her silence. "Oh," she said, "I heard you before, but I could not immediately determine what to say. You wanted me, I know, to say yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste. But I always delight in overthrowing those kinds of schemes, and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt. I have therefore made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance a reel at all. And now, despise me if you dare." "Indeed, I do not dare." Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger of falling in love, and were it not for his considerable skills in the deadly arts, that he should be in danger at being bested by hers. For never had he seen a lady more gifted in the ways of vanquishing the undead. Miss Bingley saw, or suspected enough, to be jealous, and her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane received some assistance from her desire of getting rid of Elizabeth. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking her guest, by talking of their supposed marriage, and planning his happiness in such an alliance. "I hope," she said, as they were walking together in the shrubbery the next day, "that you will give your mother-in-law a few hints when this desirable event takes place, as to the advantage of holding her tongue. And if you can compass it, do cure the younger girls of running after officers. And if I may mention so delicate a subject, endeavor to check Miss Bennet's unladylike affinity for guns, and swords, and exercise, and all those silly things best left to men or ladies of low breeding. Have you anything else to propose for my domestic felicity?" At that moment they were met from another walk by Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth herself. "I did not know that you intended for a walk," said Miss Bingley in some confusion, lest she had been overheard. "You used us abominably ill," answered Mrs. Hurst, "running away without telling us that you were coming out." Then, taking the disengaged arm of Mr. Darcy, she left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path just admitted 3. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness and immediately said, "This walk is not wide enough for our party. We had better go on to the avenue." But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with them, laughingly answered, No, stay where you are. You are charmingly grouped, and appear to uncommon advantage. The picturesque would be spoiled by admitting a 4th. Besides, that path is most assuredly rife with zombies, and I have not the inclination to engage in fighting them off today. Goodbye." She then ran gaily off, rejoicing as she rambled about, in the hopes of being at home again in a day or 2. Jane was already much recovered, as to intend leaving her room for a couple of hours that evening. Oh, right. Between chapters, I might as well. Chapter 11. When the ladies were moved after dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister, and seeing her well, attended her into the drawing-room, where she was welcomed by Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst with many professions of pleasure. Elizabeth had never seen them so agreeable as they were during the hour which passed before the gentlemen appeared. Despite their lack of fighting skill, she had to admit that their powers of conversation were considerable. "If only words were capable of beheading a zombie," she thought, "I would presently find myself in the company of the world's 2 greatest warriors." But when the gentlemen entered, Miss Bingley's eyes were instantly turned towards Darcy, and she had something to say with him before he had advanced many steps. He addressed himself to Jane with a polite congratulation. Mr. Hurst also made her a slight bow, and said he was very glad indeed that it had been but a cold and not the strange plague. But the greatest warmth remained for Mr. Bingley's salutations. He was filled with joy and attention, and the first half-hour was spent in piling up the fire lest she should suffer from the change of room. He then sat down by her and talked scarcely to anyone else. Elizabeth took to the small grinding wheel in the corner of the room and watched it all with great delight while sharpening the gentlemen's swords, which she had found embarrassingly dull upon examination. When tea was over, Mr. Hurst reminded his sister-in-law of the card table, but in vain. She had obtained private intelligence that Mr. Darcy did not wish for cards, and Mr. Hurst soon found even his open petition rejected. She assured him that no one intended to play, and the silence of the whole party on the subject seemed to justify her. Mr. Hurst had therefore nothing to do but to stretch himself on one of the sofas and go to sleep. Darcy took up a book, Miss Bingley did the same, and Mrs. Hurst principally occupied in playing cards with one of Elizabeth's And Mrs. Hurst principally occupied herself in playing with one of Elizabeth's throwing stars, joined now and then by her brother's conversation with Miss Bennet. Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book as in reading her own, and she was perpetually either making some inquiries or looking at his page. She could not win him, however, to any conversation. He merely answered her question and read on. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, which she had only chosen because it was the second volume of his, she gave a great yawn and said, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading." "Spoken like one who has never known the ecstasy of holding a still-beating heart in her hand," said Darcy. Miss Bingley, who was quite used to having her lack of combat training impugned, made no reply. She then yawned again, threw aside her book, and cast her eyes around the room in a quest for some amusement. When hearing her brother mentioning a ball to Miss Bennet, she turned suddenly towards him and said, "By the by, Charles, are you really serious in meditating a dance at Netherfield? I would advise you to consult the wishes of the present party. I am much mistaken if there are not some among us to whom a ball would rather be a punishment than a pleasure." "If you mean Darcy," cried her brother, "he may go to bed, if he chooses, before it begins. But as for the ball, it is quite a settled thing, and as soon as the ground has significantly hardened, and the present increase in unmentionables has passed, I shall send round my cards." "I should like balls infinitely better," she replied, "if they were carried on in a different manner." "You should find balls infinitely better," said Darcy, "if you knew the first thing about them." Okay, after this, I'm going to have to reread the original because, oh my god, I forgot just the biting wit of these two. Elizabeth blushed and suppressed a smile, slightly shocked by his flirtation with impropriety, and slightly impressed that he should endeavor to flirt with it at all. Miss Bingley, ignorant of his meaning, made no answer, and soon afterwards she got up and walked about the room. Her figure was elegant, and she walked well, but Darcy, at whom it was all aimed, was still inflexibly studious. In the desperation of her feelings, she resolved on one more effort, and, turning to Elizabeth, said, "Miss Eliza Bennet, Let me persuade you to follow my example and take a turn about the room. I assure you it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude." Elizabeth needed no such refreshment. She had once been ordered to maintain a handstand for 6 days in the blistering Beijing sun, but agreed to it immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded no less in the real object of her civility. Mr. Darcy looked up and unconsciously closed his book. He was directly invited to join their party, but he declined it, observing that he could imagine but two motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, either of which his joining them would upset. What could he mean? She was dying to know what could be his meaning, and asked Elizabeth whether she could at all understand him. "Not at all," was her answer. "But depend upon it, he means to be severe on us, and our surest way of disappointing him will be to ask nothing about it." Miss Bingley, however, was incapable of such self-discipline, and persevered, therefore, in requiring an explanation of his two motives. "I have not the smallest objection to answering them," said he. "You either choose this method of passing the evening because you are incapable of sitting quietly, or because you are conscious that your figure appears to the greatest advantage in walking. If the first, you are but silly girls undeserving of my attention, and if the second, I can admire you much better from here. In fact, the glow of the fire casts quite a revealing silhouette against the fabric of your gowns." "Oh, shocking!" cried Miss Bingley, stepping away from the fireplace. "I've never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?" "I have several ideas on this subject," said Elizabeth, "but I'm afraid none of them would meet the approval of the present party. Have you no insight to his weakness, you and he being so intimately acquainted?" "Upon my honor, I do not. And I do assure you that my intimacy has not yet taught me that. Mr. Darcy possesses a calmness of manner, presence of mind, and bravery in battle." "Yes, but does he not also possess vanity and pride?" "Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed," said Miss Bingley, "but pride, where there is no real superiority of mind, pride would always be under good regulation." Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile. "Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume," said Miss Bingley. "And pray what is the result?" "I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect." "No," said Darcy, "I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, of understanding. My temper I dare not vouch for. I have taken many a life for offences that would seem but trifles to other men." "That is a failing indeed," cried Elizabeth. "But you have chosen your fault well, for it is one which I share. I too live by the warrior code, and would gladly kill if my honor demanded this. You are safe from me." "There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency towards some particular evil, a natural defect, which not even the best education can overcome." "And your defect, Mr. Darcy, is to hate everybody." "And yours," he replied with a smile, is willfully to misunderstand them." "Do let us have a little music," cried Miss Bingley, tired of a conversation in which she had no share. "Louisa, will you not mind my walking Mr. Hurst? Or would you not mind my waking Mr. Hurst?" Her sister had not the smallest objection, and the pianoforte was opened. and Darcy was not sorry for it. He began to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention. Okay. Let's see. Alright, let's see. I've got... Okay. Yeah, okay. Let's see if I can make it to here. Chapter 12. In consequence of an agreement between the sisters, Elizabeth wrote the next morning to their mother to beg that the carriage might be sent for them in the course of the day. But Mrs. Bennet, who had calculated on her daughters remaining at Netherfield until the following Tuesday, which would exactly finish Jane's week, could not bring herself to receive them with pleasure before. Her answer, therefore, was disappointing. Mrs. Bennet sent them word that they could not possibly have the carriage before Tuesday, for it had been badly damaged by an errant musket balls during a skirmish between soldiers and a party of the sorry-stricken near the encampment at Meryton. This at least was partially true, for the carriage had indeed been caught in the crossfire when Catherine and Lydia used it to visit with a group of officers, but the damage was, in fact, less severe than Mrs. Bennet suggested. In her postscript, it was added that if Mr. Bingley and his sister pressed them to stay longer, she could spare them. Against staying longer, however, Elizabeth urged Jane to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage immediately, and at length was settled that their original design of leaving Netherfield that morning should be mentioned and the request made. This request excited many professions of concerns, and enough was said of wishing them to stay at least till the following day to allow the ground to further harden, and till the morrow their going was deferred. Miss Bingley was then sorry that she had proposed the delay, for her jealousy and dislike of Elizabeth much exceeded her affection for Jane. Mr. Bingley heard the real sorrow that they were to go so soon, and repeatedly tried to persuade Miss Bennet that it would not be safe for her, and that she was not enough recovered to fight in the carriage should meet. Excuse me. That it was not safe for her, and that she was not recovered enough to fight if the carriage should meet with trouble. But Jane reminded them that Elizabeth was a capable bodyguard, as there was in all of England. To Mr. Darcy it was welcome intelligence. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. She attracted him more than he liked, and Miss Bingley was uncivil to her and more teasing than her usual to himself. He resolved that no sign of admiration should now escape him. Steady to his purpose, he scarcely spoke 10 words to her throughout the whole of Saturday, and though they were at one time left by themselves for half an hour, he adhered most conscientiously to his book and would not even look at her. On Sunday, after morning service, the separation took place. Miss Bingley's civility to Elizabeth increased at last very rapidly, as well as her affection for Jane, and when they parted, after assuring the latter of the pleasure it would always give her to see her at either Longbourn or Netherfield, and embracing her most tenderly, she even shook hands with the former. Elizabeth took leave of the whole party in the liveliest of spirits. The ride to Longbourn was altogether agreeable, save for a brief encounter with a small herd of zombie children, no doubt from Mrs. Beechman's Home for Orphans, which had recently fallen along with the entire parish of St. Thomas. Mr. Bingley's coachman could not help but vomit down the front of his cravat at the sight of the tiny devils grazing on sun-hardened corpses in a nearby field. Elizabeth kept her musket close lest they advanced, but luck was on their side, and the cursed children took no notice of the carriage. They were not welcomed home very cordially by their mother. Mrs. Bennet thought them very wrong to give so much trouble, and was sure Jane would have caught cold again. Her protests were inflamed by the sight of vomit on the coachman's cravat, a sure sign that they had encountered unmentionables en route. But their father was truly glad to see them, for the evening sparring session had lost much of their animation by the absence of Jane and Elizabeth. They found Mary, as usual, in the study of human nature. Catherine and Lydia had information for them of a different sort. Much had been done and much had been said in the regiment since the preceding Wednesday. Several of the officers had dined lately with their uncle. A private had been flogged for engaging in base acts with a headless corpse, and it had actually been hinted that Colonel Forster was going to get married. Well, if you're going to stick a bunch of men together and not have any women in the vicinity, of course necrophilia is going to be a thing. Well, I guess that is one more ding onto why this book is banned. Chapter 13. Oh, wait, hold on, sorry. Okay, chapter 13. I hope, my dear, said Mr. Bennet to his wife as they were at breakfast the next morning, that you have ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to expect an addition to our family party. Who do you mean, my dear? I know of nobody that is coming, I am sure, unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call in, and I am sure my dinners are good enough for her, since she is an unmarried woman of 27, and as such should expect little more than a crust of bread washed down with a cup of loneliness. Woof! This person of whom I speak is a gentleman and a stranger. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled. A gentleman and a stranger? It is Mr. Bingley, I am sure. I shall be extremely glad to see Mr. Bingley. But good Lord, how unlikely! There is not a bit of fish to be got today. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to Hilda at this moment. It is not Mr. Bingley, you senseless old cur, said her husband. It is a person whom I never saw in the whole course of my life. After amusing himself some time with their curiosity, he thus explained. About a month ago I received this letter, and about a fortnight ago I answered it. It is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, whom, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this home as soon as he pleases. Oh, my dear, cried Mr. Wyke, pray do not talk of that odious man. I do not think it is the hardest thing in the world that your estate should be entitled away from your own children. Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain that all 5 of them were capable of fending for themselves, and they could make tolerable fortunes as bodyguards, assassins, or mercenaries as needed. But it was a subject on which Mrs. Bennet was beyond the reach of reason, and she continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling an estate away from a family of 5 daughters in favor of a man whom nobody cared anything about. It is certainly a most iniquitous affair, said Mr. Bennet, and nothing can clear Mr. Collins from the guilt of inheriting Longbourn. But if you will listen to his letter, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself. Hunsford, near West Ham, Kent, 15th October. Dear Sir, the disagreement subsiding between yourself and my late honored father always gave me such uneasiness. He was a great warrior, as you once were, and I know he looked with fondness upon the days when both of you fought side by side, back when the strange plague was but an isolated inconvenience. Since his passing, I have frequently wished to heal the breach, but for some time I was kept back by my own doubts, fearing, lest it might seem disrespectful to his memory for me to be on good terms with anyone with whom my father had once vowed to castrate. My mind, however, is now made up on the subject. For having entered the priesthood, I have been so fortunate as to be distinguished among the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Heavens! Cried Elizabeth. He works for Lady Catherine? Let me finish, said Mr. Bennet sternly. With whose skill with blade and musket are unmatched, and who has slain more unmentionable than any woman known. As a clergyman, I feel it is my duty to promote and establish the blessings of peace in all families, and if you should have no objections to receive me into your house, I propose myself that satisfaction of waiting on you and your family Monday, November 18th, by 4 o'clock, and shall probably trespass on your hospitality till the Saturday following. I remain, dear sir, with respectful compliments to your lady and daughters, your well-wishers and friend, William Collins. At 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman, said Mr. Bennet as he folded up the letter. He seems to be a most conscientious and polite young man, and I doubt not will prove a valuable acquaintance, and especially in light of his association with Lady Catherine. Mr. Collins was punctual to his time, and was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet, indeed, said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins seemed neither in need of encouragement nor inclined to be silent himself. He was a short, fat young man of 25. His air was grave and stately, and his manners were very formal. He had not been long seated before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having so fine a family of daughters, said he had heard much of their beauty, but that in the instance fame had fallen short of the truth, and added that he could hardly wait to see a display of their legendary fighting skill. You are very kind, I am sure, but I should rather see them with husbands than muskets, for else they be destitute enough, things settled so oddly. You allude perhaps to the entail of this estate. Ah, sir, I do indeed. It is a grievous affair to my poor girls, you must confess. I am very sensible, madam, of the hardships to my fair cousins, and could say much on the subject, but that I am cautious of appearing forward and precipitate. precipitate. But I can assure the young ladies that I come prepared to admire them. At present, I will not say more, but perhaps when we are better acquainted—" He was interrupted by a summons to dinner, and the girls smiled on each other. They were not only objects of Mr. Collins' admirations. Oh, they were not the only objects of Mr. Collins' admirations. The hall, the dining room, and all its furniture were examined and praised, and his commendations of everything would have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart, but for the mortifying supposition of his viewing it all as his own future property. The dinner, too, was highly admired, and he begged to know which of his fair cousins the excellency of his cooking was owing. Briefly forgetting her manners, Mary grabbed her fork and leapt from her chair onto the table. Lydia, who was seated nearest, grabbed her ankle before he could dive at Mr. Collins, and presumably stab him about the head and neck for such an insult. Jane and Elizabeth turned away so Mr. Collins could not see them laughing. He was set right by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with some asperity that they were all very well able to keep a good cook, and that her daughters were too busy training to be bothered with the kitchen. He begged pardon for having displeased Mary. In a softened tone, she declared herself not at all offended, but he continued to apologize for about a quarter of an hour. Wait. Chapter 14. During dinner, Mr. Bennet scarcely spoke at all, but when the servants were withdrawn, he thought it time to have some conversation with his guest, and therefore started a subject in which he expected him to shine, by observing that he seemed very fortunate in his patroness. Lady Catherine de Bourgh was not only one of the king's richest servants, but also one of his deadliest. Mr. Bennet could not have chosen better. Mr. Collins was elegant in his praise, offering that he had never in his life witnessed such self-discipline in a person of rank. Lady Catherine was reckoned proud by many people, but he had never seen anything but a singular dedication to the art of killing zombies. She had always spoken to him as she would any other gentleman. She made not the smallest objection to his watching her spar, nor to his leaving the parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relations. She had even advised him to marry as soon as he would, provided he chose with discretion. I have oft dreamt of watching Lady Catherine spar, said Elizabeth. Does she live near you, sir? The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence. I think you said she was a widow, sir. Has she any family? She has only one daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and of very extensive property. Ah, said Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head. Then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome? She is a most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that, in point of true beauty, Miss de Bourgh is by far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young lady of distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution, which has prevented her from following her mother's examples in regards to the deadly arts. I fear she can hardly lift a saber, let alone wield one with such skill as her ladyship. Has she been presented? I do not remember her name among the ladies at court. Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her being in town, and by that means, as I told Lady Catherine one day, has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. You may imagine that I am happy to offer these little delicate compliments, which are always acceptable to ladies. You judge very properly, said Mr. Bennet. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are the results of previous study? They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible. Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance. When tea was over, Mr. Bennet was glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he started back, and begging pardon, protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation, he chose Forsyth's Sermons. Lydia gaped as he opened the volume, and before he had, with monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, interrupted him with, "Do you know, Mamma, that my Uncle Phillips talks of an additional battalion coming to join Colonel Foster? My aunt told me so herself on Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow to hear more of it, assuming one of my sisters is willing to join me." Lydia was bid by her 2 eldest sisters to hold her tongue, but Mr. Collins, much offended, laid aside a book and said, "I have often observed how little young ladies are uninterested by books of serious stamp. I will no longer importune my young cousin." Then, turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as his antagonist at backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, observing that he acted wisely in leaving the girls to their own trifling amusements. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized for Lydia's interruption, which claimed Mrs. Bennet would have earned her 10 wet bamboo lashes had she still been under the tutelage of Master Liu. They promised that it should not occur again if he would resume his book, but Mr. Collins, after assuring them that he bore his young cousin no ill will, and should never resent her behavior as any affront, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet and prepared for backgammon. Alright, and with that, we'll call it a day. Alright. Oh, hi! Oh, no, you can't see her. When did you show up? Where have you been? Oh, ugh. We have been graced by Cat. And I think she wants food. Well, yeah, I know you don't like being held. Oh, such a good girl. Oh, yes, you are. Yes, but the internet likes Cat, and therefore I shall give the internet Cat. Okay. So, with Cat wanting food, and me done, I will cut this. Thank you for watching. Thank you for coming. If you are watching this on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. And I shall see you all later, my little dragonettes. Bye!